Last week, a Louisiana sheriff gave a press conference railing against a new prisoner release program because it cost him free labor from, quote, some good inmates that we use every day to wash cars, change oil in the cars, and to cook in the kitchen, unquote. 2 days later, news broke that up to 40% of the firefighters battling California's outbreak of forest fires are prison inmates working for $2 an hour. So write Angela Hanks and Annie McGrew in a new piece up at talkpoverty.org. Angela joins me in studio. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Angela, I was horrified when I read that the share was actually as high as 40%, as I said, of the people on the front lines battling these raging forest fires in California are actually inmates who have no choice but to be there because they're being used for their labor. And it's practically free labor. How is this even legal?
It certainly is shocking. And as much news as there's been about the devastating fires in California, this is something that's really been underreported. These are people who are incarcerated, who are making $2 an hour for what are completely dangerous jobs. I mean, ultimately they're risking their lives for pay that no other worker outside of the prison system earns. It is unbelievably true that this is actually legal. The Fair Labor Standards Act does not cover, which says that people should be paid at least the federal minimum wage, does not cover prisoners. So if you are incarcerated and you are working, you are not afforded the same rights that people who are not incarcerated are. Yet the prison system can put you in this incredibly dangerous job and say, well, we'll give you $2 an hour, which is a higher wage than most other prisoners get, but it still is $2 an hour.
So effectively, it is the law of the land in 2017 in the United States of America that prisoners can actually have their labor exploited practically for free, including in incredibly dangerous work like fighting fires.
Yes, and California is far from the outlier here. The California program has been around since the 1940s. But prison labor has existed in one form or another in this country, beginning right after slavery with convict leasing to chain gangs to the modern prison work system that we have today. So this is something that is not new, and it's always been built on the system of exploitation and on punishment.
Well, and given the disproportionate representation of people of color, and particularly men of color behind bars, this, since you mentioned slavery, I mean, it feels evocative of literally legalized slavery persisting in 2017. Am I overreaching here?
When you look at the Louisiana example, for instance, 66% of Louisiana's inmates are African American. So this is certainly, when you look at their program and you look at the history of Louisiana, both with slavery and convict leasing, and the ACLU has drawn this line in Louisiana as well, it's not hard to get there that this is something that's just taken on a modern form, but it's ultimately the same type of exploitation that state and many others have seen since the beginning of this country.
Now, you mentioned that the California inmates who have been on the front lines fighting those forest fires have been paid a whopping $2 an hour, right, if they're lucky. But they actually seem to be some of the lucky ones here. As the piece that you wrote for Talk Poverty notes, most inmates are actually paid far less for their labor.
Yes. So the average wage for an incarcerated person who's working is 86 cents an hour.
86. I just want to pause there for a second because I want people to take that in. You said 86 cents an hour is the average wage.
86 cents, less than $1. In some states, inmates are not paid for their work at all. So they are essentially performing slavery. And this is something that is happening all across the country. There are 1.5 million people in state and federal prisons, and more than half of those individuals are working for cents on the dollar in really difficult jobs, too. I mean, obviously, in California, the example of fighting fires is one where you're literally thinking about people putting their lives on the line. But, they're also doing all kinds of work around the prisons. They're working for outside for-profit and nonprofit organizations. They're building goods for the state that the state will eventually sell. I mean, they're doing real work, and they're not getting wages, and someone else is profiting off of their labor.
Your piece names a few of the types of work that people behind bars with no choice are being paid almost nothing to do. Some of those examples include grinding meat, producing Starbucks holiday products. You can think about that when you go get your pumpkin spice latte today, and even uniforms for workers at McDonald's. But one stood out to me in particular as some of the most twisted irony I can remember reading. And that's that some inmates are actually being charged with producing body armor for police officers who, in many cases, have been involved in police-involved killings, and maybe otherwise have put the safety of people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system at risk. They're even, if I'm understanding this correctly, making the targets that cops use in target practice, like literally the piece of paper that has that body outline on it that cops shoot at when they're practicing. Prison inmates are making those for the cops. Am I getting this right?
Yep, that's exactly right. They make the paper firearm targets. They make body armor. They make targets to practice shooting at vehicles. Basically, all of these instruments that the police and the military use to practice for the field, people who have been incarcerated by that same group of people are developing the products that they'll use to provide that training.
I mean, we were talking a little bit about this before we started taping, and actually my producer Will noted, and I think he's right to say this, it's reminiscent, we mentioned the slavery connection here, this part is reminiscent, to me as well, of the Holocaust. Do you feel that that's an apt comparison?
I think that we're looking at a system that is honestly, devastatingly exploitive. And there's no way to really separate this from the ugly history, both in this country and others, of exploiting marginalized people for the gain of others who have some political and social power. And so, it's hard to say, this is exactly like this other situation, but ultimately the structures around this are the same that we see in a lot of kind of exploitive and dark areas of our past.
You actually put a quote in your piece that I feel is worth reading. Shaka Senghor, an author who himself has come into contact with the criminal justice system and reflects on those experiences in a memoir. He was also featured in Ava DuVernay's acclaimed documentary released a couple of years back called 13th. And he notes in that documentary, and you quote him saying this, "The 13th Amendment says no involuntary servitude except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime." So effectively, there we go, right? If you've been convicted of a crime, our society has decided we're going to throw you back to the days of slavery or possibly even worse. So I want to not just focus on the horrible, shocking pieces that have come to light as you've done this work and as the forest fires have raged on, drawing national headlines. What are the solutions here? How do we actually move into what I would view as modern society that doesn't have slavery by another name?
Well, if you buy the argument, which I think we all should, that prison is about rehabilitation, then we should actually be trying to prepare people for a life outside of prisons and jails. So that means actually taking it seriously and trying to put in place policies that will actually help people find a job, help people pay off their debts, help people re-enter their communities and the labor market. And so one of the things that we landed on was taking these prison programs and turning them into apprenticeship programs that provide some vocational training, which has shown to increase the likelihood of employment upon release. And turn it into something where inmates are not only getting paid a wage, but they're also getting a credential at the end of the program that's valuable outside of the confines of a prison, and will also help them get a job when they're released.
Is it a crazy thought that maybe we should just say prisoners should get the minimum wage because they're doing work?
At a minimum, if nothing else happens on this topic, prisoners should be paid at least the minimum wage. That is where we have to begin. There are different ways to build programs to make them more socially useful for people who are incarcerated. But ultimately, if they don't pay a fair wage, they are not worth doing.